Welcome back to another episode of Before You Buy, the show where we give you some straight up gameplay and our first impressions of the latest games releasing. Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today I'm taking a look at the casting of Frank Stone, a new game from Supermassive, the guys behind Until Dawn, The Quarry, and the Dark Pictures games. The casting of Frank Stone is a narrative-driven adventure game with branching paths, just like all their other games, but one thing that does stand out here, and probably the defining aspect of the game, is that it is set in the Dead by Daylight universe. Now, you'd think that would make this a more streamlined, muscular Supermassive project, that it would try to mimic the game it's based on by throwing us straight into the carnage, but unfortunately that is not the case. This may be the most placid game from these developers yet, which at first was kind of intriguing actually, but then it just kept going. I mean, do I need to say it? But, and going. And then you're 20 minutes away from the end and it still feels like nothing's happened. It's very, very nothing. And this is sad. I'm not going to mince words here. This is a horror game where all the action is in the first and last 20 minutes, and the rest of the 4-hour adventure is just spent wheel spinning. You're the hamster, the wheel is there, you're in it, you're spinning it, and you're getting nowhere. Like, yeah, Supermassive is probably not in the same camp I am and wouldn't call it that. They'd probably call it world building and character development, but there's a lot of pointless backtracking, and I don't think the backtracking is character development, at least not automatically so. It's sadly like pretty intriguing in its first half, but hour 2, it just really starts to drag. Then you're begging for the killer to finally show up and take us to the fireworks factory, but even that ends up not being satisfying. It's certainly a disappointment, I guess, is the best way to say it. It's a shame, because at first I was thinking this was going to be one of the better horror stories from Supermassive. It's a really good setup here. Story's split into 3 segments. There's a prologue set in the 1960s where a young police officer searches an old steel mill for a serial killer. A framing story set in 2024 where 3 strangers meet in a spooky old mansion for mysterious reasons. And the main narrative, which takes place in 1980 and follows a few teenagers trying to make a movie. The bones of a good story are here, and the premise is intriguing at first. You got the haunted movie, the ghost of a serial killer, a mysterious witch lurking around, that 1980s setting, which is pretty much horror's bread and butter. There's even a spooky mansion with ornate puzzles all over the place. T-Virus be damned. It's a good setup for a horror story, but it's all setup. You know how setup is leading you towards a payoff? That's like the whole setup payoff dynamic. Like that's what it is. Well, it's not here. By the time the actual horror starts happening, the story is almost done. It does at least look pretty darn good for one of these games. The animation on the human characters is definitely a step up from the Dark Pictures games. Sometimes they bite off a little more than they can chew with the performance capture, but for the most part, it looks pretty damn good. The environments are appropriately spooky, and at least in the first half, there's a decent amount of variety. It seemed like we were going to be stuck in the abandoned steel mill for the entire game at first, but the 2024 segment is completely different, and the 1980s part bounces between a lot of locations in the first half. Eventually, it all devolves into a lot of running around back and forth in the steel mill, and that's when things really just get boring. But I'll say it one time, one more. It's at least an intriguing enough setup. It seems like there was an effort here to make the cast more sympathetic in general. Usually in these games, they throw in a few characters who are just there to die gruesomely, and there's at least one guy like that in this one, the Top Knot guy from the 2024 segment. We're obviously supposed to hate that guy, but pretty much everybody else, they seem like they're trying to make us care about. There's a whole lot more setup than you normally get in a Supermassive game. The Dark Pictures games pretty much throw you into the thick of things immediately, but this game has a whole lot of character building. I'm not saying all the characters are sympathetic. There are a lot of painfully lame jokes, which I guess are supposed to be endearing in some way.
And Miss
Dixie. Ms. Tammy D. Dixie.
Like, they're at least trying, and I was willing to go along with it. And if all that buildup came together at the end for something exciting and satisfying, it would have worked, but that doesn't happen here. The game pretty much just stops at a certain point, and everyone's just stuck in purgatory wandering on hallways for an hour. If you play this, you are going to get so sick of seeing that damn furnace room. You just have to go back and forth through that place like six or seven times. And it's not really even trying to be scary for the most part. Like for the vast majority of the time, you're in the mill, you're not doing anything. For a game with Frank Stone in the title, the titular character doesn't make much of an impression. This is supposed to be an origin story for him, but the game kind of gets lost in the weeds. To be fair, Dead by Daylight has some weird lore, and it's certainly worth exploring, but maybe not to this extent in a game that is about Frank Stone, because he just sort of feels like a footnote by the end of this thing. Like, it's weird to have him in the title. Lots of fun Easter eggs for Dead by Daylight players. Gonna say that. But what starts out as cute surprises starts to feel like too much after a while. Like the first time you have to find parts and repair a generator, it's kind of a cute nod. But by the third time, the gimmick is, whoa, it's old. Honestly, the game spends so much time throwing little lore tidbits and Easter eggs that it forgets about its own story. And it feels less like a standalone thing anybody can enjoy, or maybe even draw people into the Dead by Daylight universe. It kind of just ends up feeling like a big collection of references, and if I wanted to see a Marvel movie, I'd go see Deadpool and Wolverine. It's definitely better. In fact, I did see it, and I played this, unfortunately. So I guess best and or worst of both worlds. I was really willing to follow the story at first, but by the time they introduced the slasher multiverse, I was ready to be done. I know it's part of the Dead by Daylight lore, but did they really need to be that slavishly beholden to the lore of the original game when it's mainly there to justify the multiplayer matches? And you know what? I don't even want to say that they had to just explicitly make that not true in this. They just should have focused on their story. It's like if that League of Legends show Arcane was just a bunch of setup for why everybody's fighting each other in lanes. Like, you don't have to interpret things that literally. Like, give us some scary stuff with Dead by Daylight flavor. That's all we need. You don't need to cover everything. If you're making a game in that universe, the game is to provide enough of a taste of that universe, people might be intrigued enough to investigate further and find all the other stuff, because ultimately this is a narrative-driven game, and narratives can't be everything. In fact, I would argue that's been the problem with most of these Marvel movies, that Deadpool and Wolverine kind of does everything it can to tackle. But now we're getting into multiverse crap, and we don't need to. That's a whole other long discussion we don't need to have, because frankly, I think I've narratived out this before you buy so far. So I haven't even mentioned the gameplay. Most of Supermassive's other games I would describe as Telltale-like, with obviously their own kind of flavor. But ultimately, you select dialogue, you walk around a little bit, you do QTEs. It's all pretty fast-paced and cinematic, to be fair. The game tries to do something a little different, because long stretches of the game, you're just exploring the environment or solving simple puzzles. Feels less Telltale-like in those sections, more like it's trying to be like The Last of Us or something, but just the boring parts in between combat encounters. There's a lot of walking around. You go through narrow gaps, you crawl through holes. The stuff you would normally regard as like connective tissue, or perhaps even a loading screen in another game. Now that we know that that's what we were walking narrowly through paths to do, to mask the loading screen. But even if it's not for technical reasons, that stuff was meant to sort of give a break in the action, because without yin, there is no yang. Without bad, there is no good. But the problem there is this: without yang, there is no yin. Without good, there is no bad. Yes, it's good to have those little breaks in those games, but this is just the breaks. Them's the breaks, as they say. That's the whole game. It's the downtime from those other games I mentioned. Sure, you make a few choices every once in a while, but a lot of the time they do not seem to matter. Like early on, there's a choice where you can climb a fence or not to get into the steel mill, but all that happens is the scenery is a little different for about a minute. No events happen. Nothing major occurs. You just walk through some slightly different woods. Like, it's not a choice that causes a but or a therefore. You climb the fence, but this happens, or you climb the fence, therefore this happens. It's entirely an and prospect, which is not how to make a good story. You climb the fence and you go through a woods. Slightly different one, depending on whether or not you climb the fence. But and therefore are your key story words. And is not. I learned that from the South Park guys. Now, are there consequences to choices? Sometimes, yes. Characters can die, but it seems like most of them only get the chance to croak in the last half hour or so. I guess you could kill some of them earlier in events that are clearly fail states and are extremely unsatisfying, and that's it. For a horror game, almost all the kills are very unsatisfying. Multiple people get impaled on a spike, just like in the Dead by Daylight game. but that's pretty tame for a slasher kill. Most of the deaths I saw just felt like they came out of nowhere or maybe even weren't supposed to happen, which is kind of a problem for a horror game. That's the biggest issue with this thing too. It's just not scary. Like, people buy horror games for them to be at least kind of scared. Like, that's the point. But like, let's say that wasn't the point. It's not really intriguing either in any way. It plays at it for a little while, but it's mostly just boring. If you're going to charge $40 for a 4-hour story, it should just be nonstop carnage, or at least nonstop interesting things. Like, throw in multiple killers, make it a total monster mash, where some of the best killers from Dead by Daylight come in. You know, if you really need to dip into tons of Dead by Daylight stuff, that might be the way to go rather than, you know, the multiverse. Or at least that could even provide a justification for a multiverse. I don't know. I'm just riffing, and it sounds better than what happens in this game. Frank Stone could have been cool, but he's not. There's not enough of him for him to really matter. And then beyond Frank himself, there's a whole lot of wandering around a steel mill. Like, I respect what Supermassive was trying to do here and insert a few gameplay elements into their formula, but it's not enough. There's almost an action mechanic where you have to point a camera at a ghost. Sometimes, like, you film the ghost and it disappears. Not exactly the most original thing I've ever heard in 2024, but it's something, but it wasn't enough of something. It was really rudimentary, and it's, I mean, everything in this game is too rudimentary. With all that said, I don't actively dislike the game necessarily. At first, I was pretty intrigued. It was a strong start for a simple, self-contained horror adventure with some interesting twists. It just doesn't really execute. You know, it doesn't come together in a satisfying way by the end. It's not a total disaster like the second Dark Pictures game, Little Hope, which was just laughably bad at times, particularly the ending twist. But it is nowhere near the quality of something like Until Dawn. In that game, they kept the pace up. There were so many different, choices that mattered. Characters could die and it wasn't an automatic fail state. There's just nothing like that here. Like, I'm always rooting for Supermassive, even when their games disappoint me. I want to like them, even when I don't. But I just like the idea of a horror adventure game, and I want them to succeed, because they've done it well before. It's a shame that their budgets don't really allow for something like Until Dawn to be done again. Because with that kind of money, a Dead by Daylight narrative game that goes on for maybe more than 4 hours would be great. Probably. Could be, at least. This isn't that, though. It's way too light on content, way too padded out. Can't recommend this game. Not for $40. If this was a $10 or less game, probably. I think a lot of its problems are a lot more forgivable at $10. But it's $40. Like, if you are curious about this game and want to play it, there's stuff here that you will like, but not for $40. Wait for Game Pass or a deep discount on whatever store you buy it on, because do not spend that money on this. It is not worth it. I don't even think somebody who likes Supermassive, like I said, I like them, it's not worth $40. If you're not familiar or you don't particularly like that type of game or Supermassive in general, there's no hope for you here. There's nothing you're going to like about this game. Don't bother. I would say fans only, and I would say patient fans that wait for sales only. And that's all I've got to say. What do you think? Leave us a comment. Let us know. If you like this video, click like. If you're not subscribed, now's a good time to do so. We upload brand new videos every day of the week. Best way to see them first is, of course, a subscription, so click subscribe. Don't forget to enable subscriptions, and as always, we thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter, Falcon the Hero. We'll see you next time, right here on gameranx.
And Miss
Dixie. Ms. Tammy D. Dixie.
Miss Gordon. Miss Christine Gordon.